Thanks, Mark, for your excessively kind introduction, which I enjoyed precisely in proportion to its exaggeration of my accomplishments. Thanks also to the NED, to the Canadian Embassy, and to all of the sponsors of this lecture. It's nothing short of thrilling to be standing here. First of all, I'm a big fan of the NED and of the people who work at it. I'm also a big fan of Marty Lipset, who, with a bit of low-tech apparatus, a good knowledge of history, and an ability to think clearly, changed social science and our understanding of democracy. Just consider quickly, those of you who know something of the literature, his identification of the correlation of economic development and democracy, his concept of the utility of cross-cutting cleavages to soften alignments, his identification of the trade-off between legitimacy and effectiveness, not to mention his studies of Canada and the United States. This is just off the top of anybody's head who knows his oeuvre. In the bargain, Marty was also a considerate, thoroughly decent person. This is the 53rd anniversary of the publication of his masterful book, Political Man. I'm not generally an enthusiast of citation counts, but when I looked a few months ago, from 1974 to 2013, it seems to have been cited 37,977 times, and it has sold nearly 500,000 copies. As advertised, I want to talk today about 3 neglected problems in the attempt to achieve durable ethnic accommodation and a democratic politics in societies severely divided by ethnicity, race, religion, language, or any other form of ascriptive, that is to say, birth-based affiliation. I'm going to stay close to my text or else I won't finish on time tonight. And I'll talk at a reasonable pace, but I promise to slow down at the bad terms. Ethnicity can be a problem for democracy because of ethnic voting. If the A's with 60% of the voters can lock out the B's with 40% in perpetuity, then you can imagine what the B's are thinking, that they will never, ever come close to power, and they may be subject to the whim and abuse of the A's. So it's, in the end, a matter of domination and how to prevent it. I think you'll see that none of the 3 problems that I'll discuss today has a particularly satisfying answer. Maybe we should keep it away from the Burmese. And this is part of the reason why so many ethnically divided countries have difficulty establishing a polity that is both multi-ethnic and democratic. You may even see this presentation as an example of the adage that in social science there are many approaches but few rivals. The 3 problems are, and don't let the terminology get to you because I'm going to define the terms. First, the adoption problem that generally impedes the establishment of a regime of democratic interethnic accommodation. Second, what I want to call the degradation problem in cases in which a centripetal model of interethnic accommodation is established. I promise this will not be as complicated as it sounds. And third, the immobilism problem that attends the establishment of a fully consociational regime in the few cases in which such a durable regime can be established. I wonder if I could get some water here. I'm sure somebody, yes, I see. There will be a response. So just a few quick definitions, and with that we can have the first slide. A consociational regime is a regime of guarantees. It's an elaborate regime of agreed guarantees for ethnic groups, especially for minorities. Elected representatives of all of the groups are in government. This is not majority rule and minority in opposition. This is guaranteed inclusion. Secondly, all groups have a veto over ethnically sensitive issues. Again, a minority guarantee. Thirdly, there's proportional representation of the groups in government in proportion to their representation in parliament, and a proportional electoral system to be sure that proportionate inclusion is approximately correct. Fourth, proportional representation in the groups in government service and in financial allocations, and finally, group autonomy in cultural matters. Not everybody who's a consociationalist agrees with all of these points, but this is the general thrust of the main consociational argument, that one establishes this kind of regime, an inclusive consensual regime, not government versus opposition. As you can imagine, a prominent hazard of such a system is immobilism, that is, the inability to get things done when groups can and do say no. Now, the second model is the centripetal one, which means centripetal in the sense that the various contestants should move toward the center, toward a moderate, compromising outcome. The centripetal model gives politicians electoral incentives to behave moderately toward groups other than their own in order to form multi-ethnic coalitions to pool votes across group lines and to produce a majority government of moderates rather than a fully inclusive government with strict minority guarantees. This is, in other words, inter-ethnic majority rule, and it's incentives, not guarantees, that are doing the work where this model is followed. For today, although I must say I have my own views, and we can talk about them if you like in the question period afterwards, let's not debate which of these prescriptions is better for inter-ethnic conciliation. There is a lively debate on this, and one side does periodically, albeit prematurely, declare victory. But today's issues concern endemic adoption problems. Can you get either prescription adopted? And transition problems. That is, what forms of change occur that have negative effects on centripetal regimes, and what changes can be accomplished when necessary in countries where stalemate and immobilism afflict a consociational regime. Given the importance of these issues, you'll be shocked, I mean really shocked, to learn that in the prodigious literature on the politics of ethnic accommodation in severely divided societies, there is nearly nothing on these problems, just debates about which prescription is better. There's been very little thought about when power sharing can be adopted, how it can go wrong, and what it takes to repair it. Bear in mind that in the absence of some form of remediation, ordinary majority rule usually results in majority ethnic domination, and it can produce rebellion among minorities. Ethnic domination is, after all, the default setting. So now if we can have the third slide, a few preliminary and approximate statistics. These were gathered with the very active assistance of Asfia Tareen, who is seated someplace out there in the middle of the audience, and I'm very grateful to her for doing this. I couldn't have done it alone. So for these statistics, we start with a larger number than the 78 at the top. It's 123 countries in Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, the Middle East, and the Caribbean, the areas with, after all, the most intense ethnic conflict. Not every country, of course, but the areas where the conflict is most intense in general. Of these 123 countries, 78, or 65%, in fact, you'll be better off if you stay with the numbers than the percentages, 78 experienced some severe ethnic conflict episodes between 1980 and 2010. Of these, how many then adopted or practiced either consociational or centripetal power sharing or some hybrid at the center of politics? That's what we're talking about, not devolution in the regions. The answer is that approximately 20 did, about 26%. Now, we have a loose and inclusive criterion for getting to that number. We include any country that has just one or more than one centripetal or consociational device or practice. So that's a low threshold. All you need is one, a low threshold for inclusion in the group that's done something about this along the lines of either prescription. As I say, we've excluded devolution only because that's not power sharing at the center, and we've excluded temporary arrangements of 3 years or fewer, as, for example, in the case of Kenya in 2008. Of the 20 cases, 8 of these were aborted at the outset or failed to endure 3 years or more. Of the remainder, about 9 or 12% have lasted 5 years or more, but 5 of the 9, by my count, you may have a different count, 5 of the 9 are shaky, undemocratic, or immobilized, or, in the case of Sudan, led to secession. This is not a very good record. Very few are durable and functioning and more or less democratic. So have a look at that, because I'm going to turn it off in just a minute to recapture your attention by ear rather than by eye. As long as you see that it's 20 out of 78 and we get down to 9 at the bottom, you've got the point. Okay, I think we've got it. Thanks. So the first problem, the initial adoption problem, can you get either prescription adopted, is surpassingly important, but the obstacles to adoption are so many and so complicated that I can only give you a taste of them here. I've written a lot about them in a book by Andrew Reynolds called The Architecture of Democracy and an issue of Nomos and some other places too. But here's a quick enumeration of the obstacles to adoption. First, and perhaps foremost, the asymmetric preferences of the contending groups. Majorities want majority rule. Minorities want guarantees against majority rule. So minorities like consociational democracy and majorities don't. Consociation, therefore, can be adopted only when majorities are weak, and if they have a chance later, they will try to overthrow it, as they did in Cyprus, for example, in 1963, or as they may be in the process of thinking about doing in Burundi right now. Second, another obstacle is general risk aversion. This is a high-stakes game, so stay with what is familiar, which may, of course, be the wrong answer. Third, biases. Negotiators do not come to the table innocent and naked. They have biases that rule in some models, often favoring institutions in the most successful democracies like the United States or the United Kingdom or Switzerland or Canada, I should say, which generally don't have their problems. Or they may favor institutions from the ex-colonial power. Models from the colonial period get ruled in, and then those models rule out alternatives. So we can call this, in general, model bias. The negotiators in constitutional exercises also have historical biases that often tell them to avoid repeating institutional choices that they see as mistakes from the past, even though their reading of their own history may be contestable or conditions may have changed since then. I can give you some examples of that. Indonesia is full of them, actually. Biases narrow choices. Fourth, the visibility of interests, the apparent visibility of interests. Participants think they know what institutions are in their interest, and that too narrows choices, even though they were often 180 degrees wrong about some of those choices that were made in Eastern Europe after the end of communism. But generally, there is no Rawlsian veil of ignorance here. That is to say, the participants come to the table with a whole set of preferences and interests that they see, that they think they can see into the future. Where there is a veil of ignorance, on the other hand, where everybody agrees that it's not possible to see easily into the future, you can get some better decisions, and I will cite one such case later. And fifth, the availability of alternatives. If it's post-conflict, then the rebels can withdraw and go back to the bush to fight again, even after they've agreed to an arrangement, either along consociational or centripetal lines. Jonas Savimbi and UNITA in Angola in 1994 went back to the bush after they had agreed on a consociational scheme. Well, I could go on and on about these obstacles, but this is enough to show why agreements to establish political institutions intended to conciliate ethnic conflicts are rare, and even when they are made, they can fall apart very quickly. Now, you may say, with respect to asymmetric preferences, only if majorities are weak will they accept a regime of consociational guarantees. Indeed, that is exactly what I said. So when will they then accept a centripetal regime of cross-ethnic vote pooling? Well, the easy answer might be when outside experts recommend them. But this is rare, because international experts tend to favor proportional representation and a regime of guarantees. Rather, it's when the majority has reason to agree, especially a majority that's having trouble getting elected and governing alone. Usually, there is, as I say, an electoral reason, when minorities have valuable votes to offer. Consider, for example, the case of Malaysia. Repeatedly misclassified as consociational. It had no consociational devices, it had no grand coalition, it had no minority veto, and it had no proportionality. As a matter of fact, the proportions were the other way. They favored the majority, and still do, actually. It was, on the other hand, in its heyday, an inter-ethnic majoritarian vote pooling coalition. No experts were involved in designing it. Rather, the leading Malay party was in danger of losing to a popular multi-ethnic party at a time when Chinese minority votes could swing the election. And this was the origin of a quite durable multi-ethnic coalition, which lasted well over a decade. But, well, more on the but soon, not just yet. A second occasion for the adoption of centripetal devices is when there is, as I say, unusually a veil of ignorance. In Nigeria in 1978, after pogroms and civil war and a dozen years of military rule, no one knew who would be the next victim of ethnic strife. So they chose one centripetal device, which was designed to produce a pan-ethnic president. Unfortunately, they chose only one, but the one they chose, I think, was well chosen. It was to elect a pan-ethnic president by means of two sets of requirements. The person elected president in Nigeria had, and still has to have had, a plurality of votes, that is to say the largest number, even if short of 50%, plus territorial distribution, that is 25% of the vote in no fewer than 2/3 of the states. The idea was to have the presidential candidates make deals all around the country with groups other than his or her own. And for the most part, this scheme has worked in Nigeria. Many other things are wrong in Nigeria. Don't get me wrong, I'm not whitewashing Nigeria. But this particular device worked more or less as it was intended. Well, so much for the very serious adoption problem. Dealing with conflict-prone countries is hard. What it shows is the wisdom of the story of the American tourist in the west of Ireland who stops a local to ask the shortest route to Dublin. The local thinks for a moment and then he responds, "I wouldn't start from here." If you want a democratic conciliatory regime, don't start with ethnically conflict-prone countries. Now, a very quick trip through problem 2, the degradation problem with centripetal electoral institutions, using Malaysia as an example. I told you that the Malaysians had established a multi-ethnic coalition called the Alliance before independence in the 1950s. Malays and non-Malays, and by non-Malays I mean Chinese and Indians, were intermixed in electoral constituencies so that even under an Anglo-American first-past-the-post or plurality electoral system, the alliance in the center of the political spectrum found it advantageous to pool Malay and non-Malay votes through the mechanism of running a single slate of candidates agreed in advance, and in so doing managed to defeat extremist Chinese and Malay parties on the two flanks. They produced a constitution that compromised ethnic claims and established the principle that what they called one-race government was illegitimate. In other words, electoral needs resulted in moderation. But then, considerably, a dozen years after independence, something happened. The Malay partner, the United Malays National Organization, or UMNO, realized that it could reduce its dependence on Chinese votes by gerrymandering, by packing Chinese into large constituencies and Malays into smaller ones, so that one Malay vote was worth much more than a non-Malay vote. And the non-Malays in the coalition lost their power to elect a proportionate number of members of parliament and to effect a great many policy decisions. There's much more to the story than this, but even this tidbit shows that the Achilles heel of electoral incentives as the route to durable interethnic accommodation is the failure of the rule of law in many transitional countries. Unfortunately, the establishment of nonpartisan electoral commissions that stay impartial depends on a vibrant rule of law. But the rule of law, as the literature now shows pretty well, tends to follow rather than precede the establishment of democratic regimes and to be dependent on a particular configuration of political alignments. I can't go down that road here. I just want to note that centripetal regimes can depend on arrangements that prove fragile. You can get a lot of slippage in centripetal regimes. There are ways to make them a little bit less fragile, but there are very few ways to make them completely solid. And that brings me to problem 3. Once you have an established consociational regime, which, as you will recall, it is difficult to establish, almost always it's established because the majority is temporarily weak and it dislikes minority guarantees but must accept them under the circumstances, and the weakness can come from a variety of sources. You will see that the obligation to have an inclusive government coupled with the minority veto is highly likely to produce stalemate, an inability to get things done, serious immobilism, and therefore unhappiness with the arrangements, especially on the part of the majority that didn't like them to begin with. Now, some writers say that consociation is best for calming a conflict to begin with, but then you should be able to move to other institutions, probably centripetal ones. And indeed, these centripetal institutions are often proposed for stalemated consociations. I'll mention a few in a little bit. None of these writers who suggest that a transition be made from consociational to centripetal or other institutions, with one exception that I'm going to mention, tells you how to get from here to there. And that shows, again, the neglect of the adoption problem, because this is a species of the adoption problem. So what happens? Here's a quick tour of 5 cases of the best fulfillment of the consociational prescription. 1. Cyprus, 1960. Cyprus adopted a strongly consociational regime because the Greek side was weak in the negotiations for independence. There were lots of vetoes built in, and the Turkish vice president exercised those vetoes and indeed exercised them to the max. Archbishop Makarios, the leader of the Greek Cypriots, finally in 1963 overthrew the consociational regime, producing in the process quite a lot of ethnic violence and the separation of groups that had formerly lived pretty closely together. This was followed by the Turkish invasion of 1974 and the partition that's been in effect ever since. The Greek majority in 2004, in a referendum, rejected a new consociational dispensation. It had had enough of that. So we have now 2 homogeneous states. There was a further effort in 2010 to introduce a centripetal electoral system. That was rejected by the Turks at the polls. Second, Bosnia. A strongly consociational regime agreed at Dayton. Why? Because the Bosniaks, who are a plurality or perhaps by now a majority, were temporarily weak. I can tell you why. It's a long story. But the Bosniaks hate the consociational regime. They chafe at the bit. They want a single civic polity. The Serbs threaten warfare if their autonomy is withdrawn. And the Croats actually want more minority guarantees through the creation of a third entity. They are a minority in an entity they share with the Bosniaks. The other entity is the Republika Srpska for Serbs. There have been many attempts to change this in Bosnia, usually coming from outside, because the international community, so to speak, quickly soured on what at least the United States had accepted at Dayton. The United States didn't impose this. It accepted this from the minorities at Dayton. So in the late 1990s, many proposals for a centripetal electoral system to encourage interethnic moderation went nowhere. In 2006 and 2009, there were efforts to reduce the complexity of the guarantees. They also went nowhere. There's a new effort ongoing now, and it has been ongoing for months. I was in Bosnia in February. Academics overwhelmingly now love the centripetal alternative, but the current system is hard to change. Third, Northern Ireland. Perhaps the most successful of the consociational regimes. It's brought peace, at least. But there the 2 groups had very moderate attitudes to begin with. If you look at the surveys, you'll be astounded by how low on the conflict register the responses of Protestants and Catholics were to questions which would have allowed them to express their antipathy toward the other group. Nevertheless, there have been lots of stalemates on the most contentious issues, and now the 2 parties that agree on next to nothing, namely the Democratic Unionist Party founded by Ian Paisley, and Sinn Féin, the party of the Irish Republican Army, those 2 parties are now in the driver's seat, and they cannot agree on measures of ethnic accommodation promised at Belfast in 1998. That's 15 years ago, relating, for example, to the Irish language or a Bill of Rights. Richard Haas of the Council on Foreign Relations is currently in Northern Ireland on a mission of conciliation, and we should all wish him very good luck because he will need it. Fourth, Belgium. Consociational gridlock to the max. 1 year, more than 1 year, to form a government at the center in 2010 through 12, and again since 1970, a retreat from government at the center to government only in the homogeneous regions of Flanders and Wallonia. Consociation as a soft, maybe even soon a complete partition. That's the way to think about Belgium. And now the interethnic Pavia group has proposed a federal constituency for the whole country so that at least a few representatives in the legislature will be elected by a heterogeneous constituency in order to foster vote pooling and moderation. It's a centripetal device, but it would only affect 10% of the seats. It's far from adequate. Fifth, Burundi. Since 2005, the Hutu majority of 85% has tolerated, and that's the right word, a tightly consociational regime. But now it looks as if the Hutu representatives of the ruling party have enough votes to overthrow it, and the president has indicated he's ready for a big change. This could produce a mono-ethnic and authoritarian regime, and indeed some people say that the authoritarian part of it is already achieved. And very likely, Tutsi violence yet again in a country torn apart by genocide. So think of this as Cyprus to the nth degree. The International Crisis Group says that Burundi is now de facto already a one-party system, and that party is a Hutu-dominated party. So has any consociational regime managed to make a transition? Yes. There are 2 European cases, but they are not of much help to the cases that we've been talking about or similarly situated cases. The 2 cases are the Netherlands and Austria. I'm reaching down here because yes, there it is. I'm looking, oh, I see, it's the bottom of the bottle that is uneven. It is not the thing on which it is seated. You have to do research even when you're at the podium. The 2 cases are the Netherlands and Austria. In both the Netherlands and Austria, there were consociational regimes because of social polarization. There was really pillarization of the society, that is to say, a very high degree of cradle-to-grave compartmentalization. In the Netherlands, the cleavages were based on religion and class. There was a Calvinist pillar, there was a Catholic pillar, and then there was a pillar of secular liberals. In Austria, more or less the same division. 3 pillars: Catholic agrarian, urban socialist, secular anti-clerical, and also anti-socialist liberal. There was a brief civil war fought between the segments in Austria in the 30s. People have forgotten this. In both cases, social change, especially the growth of the urban service sector and the white-collar middle class, in addition to secularization and erosion of religious affiliations, resulted in depillarization, if I can coin that term. The underlying social compartments with all their associated organizations simply broke down. There are no more exclusive social circles, and this change freed voters to vote outside any quasi-ascriptive allegiances that they had had before. And the result is ordinary majoritarian politics without grand coalitions or vetoes or anything else that's consociational. Now, neither of these cases will help the 3 bad Bs, Belgium, Bosnia, or Burundi, or Northern Ireland for that matter, because there it's all really ethnic, not quasi-ethnic. It's not as if people were born into a certain category and then the category erodes. They are born into a category. And social change, the literature suggests, often makes ethnic cleavages sharper, as indeed it has in Belgium, not softer. Now, there is one proposal for moving out of stalemate and into something else, and this one takes the prize for what I want to call constitutional engineering chutzpah. It's the proposal by a legal scholar at NYU Law School who's come only recently from American constitutional law and then with a light footprint into this field. In Bosnia in 2000, the Bosnian Constitutional Court consisting of 3 foreign judges, plus 2 Serbs, 2 Croats, and 2 Bosniaks, for a total of 9, the 3 foreigners plus the 6 others. That court held that the constitutions of the 2 entities that form Bosnia were themselves unconstitutional under the overarching Bosnian constitution adopted at Dayton, because neither entity, remember there's the Federation and the Republika Srpska, Neither entity had made provision for all three peoples to be what the language of Bosnia calls constituent peoples of both entities. In other words, if you were a Bosniak, you didn't have a secure position in the institutions of the Republika Srpska. You couldn't elect people to certain offices in the Republika Srpska because they were designated for Serbs. And if you were a Serb, you couldn't elect people in the Federation because the Federation was for Croats and Bosniaks. And so the Constitutional Court of Bosnia held these arrangements to be unconstitutional. The court ordered dramatic institutional changes so that each of the three groups would be represented in the institutions of both. The vote was 5-4, with the three foreign judges, along with the two Bosniak judges, subscribing to the Bosniak political agenda of decompartmentalizing Bosnia. Now, two things should be said about this decision. The first is that the foreign judges were written into the Constitution at Dayton for a different purpose. They were there so that judges from no two of the three groups could simply outvote judges of the third by 4-2 and damage the ethnic interests of the third group. Here, however, the three foreigners took sides and joined one of the three groups to produce a majority of 5. The second thing that needs to be said, and said clearly about the constitutional law adumbrated in that decision, is that it is fictitious. Since at Dayton, everyone knew what the earlier adopted entity constitutions provided. They dated back in the Republika Srpska case to 1992, Dayton is 95, and in the Federation case, only a year earlier, 1994. The whole idea was a soft partition. So this decision was ethnically biased and based on something other than the documents being interpreted, perhaps not the best ingredients for the cultivation of constitutionalism. This kind of excessively creative interpretation indeed sets a bad example for courts elsewhere. Now, presumably unaware of this background, the NYU legal scholar whom I mentioned concluded as follows. Courts, he says, can act, and here I'm quoting, as unwinders of ethnic political bargains, unquote. In other words, they can make the transition that others cannot make for themselves. But of course, we need the rule of law to enforce political bargains rather than unwind them, and courts won't generally be able to act as unwinders. Nevertheless, this is the only concrete suggestion that I've seen in the literature for how to get from consociation to something else. One final point before I summarize, and by the way, one reason for that lack of literature on transitions is that people are committed to either consociational arrangements or centripetal arrangements, not always called centripetal, sometimes wrongly called integrative. One final point before I summarize. I don't want just to beat up on consociations. Centripetal institutions have their problems. Consider the requirements to be elected president in Nigeria and Kenya. I talked about the Nigerian ones early. Nigeria was the pioneer in this. By sheer chance, I happened to have been there when this was done, and I was a consultant to the Igbo delegation that was interested in this provision. They pioneered it, the plurality plus 25% in 2/3 of the states for the presidential election. The idea was to encourage candidates to, as I said, make deals with groups other than their own, with ethnic groups all across the country. But in Kenya, under the 2010 Constitution, the successful candidate needs a majority of votes plus 25% in half, that is to say, 24 of the 47 counties. Not states, counties. Kenya doesn't have states. It has devolution to the county level. 25% in 24 of the 47 counties. Notice how this opens the way to mischief, to the possibility that supporters of a candidate could try to do ethnic cleansing to push supporters of other candidates out of a small unit like a county. They can't really do that in Nigeria. The states are much too big for that. Kenya has had ethnic cleansing before other elections, and it has the possibility of the same phenomenon again. Borrowing has to be done extremely carefully. This formula is not a good formula in Kenya. The broader lesson is that no approach is fail-safe. If you rely on incentives to moderation, incentives will produce counter-incentives on the part of those who wish to defeat the incentives to moderation. If you use the incentives approach, the actors will adapt to unfavorable conditions and seek to reverse them. In fact, if you use either approach, those who are disadvantaged, as they see it, will try to reverse them, as Greek Cypriots did, as Bosnian Muslims, that is, Bosniaks have tried to do, as Malays did as well. There's an old Kazakh proverb that says, the wind will always find a patched tent. Ethnic power-sharing institutions are all patched tents. So how to summarize? Problem one, the difficulty of adoption in the first instance. The bargaining problem means that many troubled states will not adopt either centripetal or consociational institutions. Instead, they will opt for a democratic form that they are accustomed to. Straightforward majority rule with minority rights, which won't work because majority rule will be ethnic majority rule and minority rights won't be enforced because in the absence of a strong rule of law, the majority will control the courts. The democratic default, as I said earlier, is majority rule and minority rights. The authoritarian default is majority domination. One is just a softer version of the other. Other states will reach a variety of non-consociational, non-centripetal bargains, borrowing an odd device here and there from either toolkit, and some in the international community, a term I don't really like, but I have no choice but to use it because there isn't one international community, in case you were wondering. Some in the international community will be very happy if they do ad hoc adoption of this or that, because they will say, quote, whatever the parties agree to, so long as they get to yes, is acceptable. That's what they will say, and they will usually be wrong, but by then they will be long gone from the country. For problem two, the degradation of centripetal institutions by a variety of majority manipulations, we don't have a good answer for that, just as we don't have an answer for problem three. But let me say, by the way, it's much harder to degrade institutions at the presidential level because you're not delimiting constituencies at the presidential level if that's where your centripetal devices are located. But we don't have a good answer for problem two, just as we don't have an answer for problem three, the escape from consociational immobilism. So far, it looks like no exit. For all three problems, the adoption question is the orphan of the world of interethnic accommodation. Many states that need conciliatory institutions will not get them. If they get them, will not keep them if majorities are able to break out of them. And if they are stuck in them, will not be able to change them when change is necessary. Thank you very much.